Good evening, Damien Migalo.
Good evening, Bob.
You are speaking to us from Madrid, Spain,
Correct?
and we are honored to have you with us. And I know you because we traveled together in September to Garabandal, Spain.
I'm honored to be on your podcast because looking at the names and the prowess of the people you've interviewed this week, I'm kind of like the weekend of the week.
No, actually, Damien, you're too humble. Getting to know you and traveling with you and talking with you, I have learned that you are one in the entire world of the people who has the most articulated, comprehensive, thoughtful, and faithful knowledge of everything that happened at Garabandal.
Well, why, thank you. I don't know how to respond to that, but I think there's a fair bit stored up here since I first heard about Garabandal as a child,
All right,
growing up in England.
I'm going to introduce you then as an expert on Garabandal who comes from England, but you had an Irish mother, a Spanish father whose name was Migalo, hence
Correct.
your name, Damien Migalo.
And
And
the Irish surname is Devlin, just to
Damien
prove my
Devlin
credentials.
Migalo,
Migalo Devlin.
Migalo Devlin. And you traveled outside of England already, I guess, at the age of 10 or 15, you said.
Yeah, the first time I visited Spain as a child, I was 10 years old.
Okay. So
But still didn't know about Garabandal then.
okay. And then you went back and you became a school teacher, which is one of the most noble of professions because you take young children and you make them into adults. You form their minds and their hearts and their souls. You're a religion teacher.
For most of my teaching career, I taught religion in Catholic schools,
All
um,
right.
mainly the teenagers up to before they went to university.
And
And
you've been living now in Madrid, Spain for how long?
for about 12 years now.
12 years. So you speak Spanish. And
Correct.
let's go then to Garabandal. Do we have a photo of Damien in Garabandal? There you are. And very surprisingly, what we are doing is listing the name of one of the four seers, the girls of Garabandal, who in the 1960s were able to receive the apparition of the Virgin Mary. And we're listing her as Jacinta Moynihan, which is my name. And you are there with her. This is last September 2023. So this is what, 5 months ago. You are
And
talking.
you were the
Yeah,
cameraman, Bob.
I took this photo.
Yeah.
So there's several perplexities here. Why is Jacinta of Garabandal called Moynihan? Why are you, Damien from England, with the Spanish father Migalo, talking to her? Why are we in Garabandal after more than 50 years? And is it 50? 50?
It's getting on for
1960,
60.
getting
60.
close. So in 2025, it will be 60 years. So this woman is now in her 70s, and she was about 12 years old when she, in the 60s, received the vision of the Virgin Mary. This is Jacinta. And what were you talking with her about?
Well, if you want to plug the book, this is not my book. It's written by a Spanish journalist who's quite well known called Jose Maria Zavala. She conducted an interview with the Spanish journalist in 2021. And if you want to start talking about that now, I will. it,
Well, what does the
it,
title
it,
mean?
Los últimos tiempos ya están aquí. The final times, the end of times are here now.
The end of
And
times are here.
which is the implication. If you look at what Garabandal is about, it's pointing very much to the end of times, the biblical end of times, the end of times of our own era. And
Well,
the interview,
a modest topic and a modest reality that time is
well,
coming to an end.
it requires a leap of faith in itself over and above everything else you believe in. If you're a Catholic, Yeah.
Okay, well, let's try to go into that. Now, we know there are many doubts and scoffers, and to a certain extent, I myself, oh, Gonzalo Suarez, greetings from Sao Paulo, Brazil. So we're reaching, oh, Elaine Murphy, what she's,
Ethna.
is, oh, Ethna Murphy, is she in Garabandal? Do you know her?
I don't, but I've seen her name from your podcast. She definitely
Okay.
contributes.
All right, now, Edward W., this apparition has never been approved or denied. It always has intrigued everyone. Okay, I think that
Oh,
about sums it up.
I
I,
totally agree
I
with
think
that.
that is where we stand. She's in Ireland, okay. The Emerald
But
Isle.
she wishes she was in Garabandal, like all of us.
I see. Okay. And a loyal Catholic greetings from Calgary, Canada. So we've got North America, South America, Ireland, which is it's another continent, Europe, and here you are in Madrid, Spain, and we've got the end of times, which I'm sure we can interpret that in different ways, and maybe we still have a few years left, or maybe much more than that, because maybe we could interpret it spiritually. Maybe there's something that doesn't end and something that does end. But we're talking about four children who had very compelling, over 4 years, visions or apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And of the fascinating thing is that there's many videotapes because the videotape camera had been invented already in the 40s and 50s. And people flocked when they heard of these visions and they took pictures. And so you can see movies of the children.
Yeah, and they're all
And,
over the internet. Yeah.
and three of the four are still alive today. One has passed away. But interestingly, the one who passed away, who was Mariloli,
Yes. Mariloli Gonzalez. No, Mariloli Mathon.
okay,
Mathion.
Mary Lowley, she married someone from Massachusetts, and I
Correct.
only found out just a year or two ago that the man was from Haverhill, Massachusetts, or near there, and that she died there in 2010, one of the four girls of Garabandal, and she was buried in April in St. James Parish Cemetery, and that is the parish of my father, William Moynihan. And behind me on the wall is my uncle. His name was Robert Moynihan. He was born in St. James Parish in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where Mary Lowley is buried. How do you explain that?
It's such a small world, isn't it?
Yeah. And
Uncanny.
then Jacinta married a man named Jeffrey Moynihan, who was a sailor of the United States Navy, who came to Spain in the 1960s, heard about the girls having their visions, was very intrigued, and decided he wanted to go there himself, see for himself, very pragmatic. And he went and they were living there, and he went and talked to Jacinta, and they fell in love, and he asked her to marry him. And so that's why Jacinta is named Moynihan. And Jeffrey Moynihan is not related to me, but it's the same name. So there you have, Damien, a few crumbs of divine providence and mystery which have compelled me to try to understand Garabandal better, and I find no better guide than you.
Well, we've been talking about this, and the fact that it allowed you to, it moved you to reinvestigate Garabandal. You said you knew about it a long time ago, but it was only more recently that you began to look at it. And these little things that happened, this connection with the Moynihan clan, for example, this connection with Massachusetts, it made you want to see what Garabandal was about in a much more profound way. And I think God is allowing you to draw many, many other people to reinvestigate Garabandal for
All
themselves.
right, let's possibly see Jacinta one more time if we can, and then we also have an interview here which I actually recorded, and we can show that in a future program. She's
Mhm.
You wanted to ask her about a book that she's written that went in Spanish. You showed us the title. You can do that again.
She didn't
Uh,
write it. It's the product of an interview with a quite a well-known Spanish journalist who has an interest in these sorts of things. you see him on television quite regularly. He was on last weekend talking about something completely different. I think he was talking about the relic of the chalice, the Holy Grail that is in Valencia Cathedral, which has also been in the news yesterday. A very, very tragic apartment fire
Oh,
in the city of Valencia. So we should be praying for those poor souls right now. But this book is a product of an interview that he conducted over the phone with Jacinta between Madrid and California during the summer of 2021.
okay. We
And
should explain just for our viewers. Jeffrey Moynihan came from New York, but he was working with the Navy and then later got a job in California. And therefore, Jacinta went with him to California and they have a child. And they've been for many years in California. And then she comes back to Garabandal and we're here. She was back during August and September, and we were there in September. And that's her house behind there. That little house with the leaves all around, and there's laundry there. And she's an American. She's a Spaniard. She's a she's a visionary, and she's given an interview now by telephone to a prominent Spanish journalist at the sort of later part of her life to revisit these apparitions, which in some ways everyone is still fascinated by, but they seem not to have come to pass, not the things that were predicted or prophesied haven't occurred. So it seemed almost to be out of the news. But the book came out. We wanted to go see her. Jeffrey said it would be okay. We would be very respectful. And we had a wonderful time. And you asked her about the book and why she decided to kind of break her many decades of silence. She's not spoken. She had Conchita has given interviews over the years. One of the other three girls, but
the chronology of the
Jacinta's
interviews, the chronology
yeah.
of the interviews needs to be mentioned here, Bob. Really, Conchita hasn't been interviewed since the BBC interview, which brought Garabandal to my attention in 1980.
Okay,
And
so
any other interviews have really only taken place when they were very young, back in the 70s.
okay, we're saying for 40,
has
40.
never, has
Okay, so 40 plus years from Conchita.
more, I'd say more.
43 years from 1980 till now. And Jacinta.
Jacinta has never gone on record to this extent, and it was prompted in 2021 by a newspaper interview with the fourth visionary, who's the only one who stayed in Spain. She lives in the north of Spain, Maricruz. Now, a newspaper interview appeared in June of 2021 with Maricruz, and I think this prompted Jose Maria Zavala to contact Jacinta to ask his own questions, to see if Jacinta would say anything different, to see if she could say any more than had ever been said. And with the backdrop of having lived her life, it is a very, very interesting collection of responses.
Okay, so this is the first point that we really have to make. The Garabandal message was excitedly followed during the 1960s. It continued to have interest and kind of international following through the 70s. There was a BBC interview in 1980 with Conchita, who also married someone from America and lives, as I understand it, on Long Island.
Yep. She's still in the New York area. Yep.
New York area. And Jeffrey told me that Jacinta went to Conchita's house in Long Island. They got in a car at the time of Mary Lowley's death, and they went up to her funeral to St. James Church in Haverhill, Massachusetts. They went in by car. So they passed right through Connecticut, where I grew up, and they went to Haverhill, where my father grew up. My father was baptized and confirmed and was an altar boy in St. James Church. So what we're looking at is the
most important thing that I'm asking Jacinta in that photograph, which really connects us up to this book that I keep referring to. It's only in Spanish, and for the past 2 years, I'm sure many people have been hoping that it was going to be translated and distributed in English. I put the question to her if she would approve of it being translated into English and brought to the attention of many more people. And she said yes. She consented when we were talking to her there in that photograph, to it
Uh-huh.
being translated. And the next step would be to contact the author, the publishers, to see how we could go about doing that.
All right.
And
And I think
incidentally,
we're,
if you remember, Bob, next to us, there were some Portuguese pilgrims, and they were asking her the same thing. So those of you who are listening who have Portuguese as your first language, she was effectively saying that, yes, this book can and should be translated into all of the languages, Portuguese included.
okay. So our first point is that after 43 years and maybe 50 or 60 years for Jacinta, there's a desire to speak again in old age, we might say. She's in her
With the
70s
backdrop
now.
of having lived her life, yes,
With
definitely.
that, and already that question is of great interest to me because who can live a life having had dozens of visions of the Virgin Mary, feeling her speak to you, almost caress your cheek, and then 50 or 60 years go by, you live life with all of its joys and sorrows, and the apparitions remain in your memory, and yet maybe start to become distant. That's one great question I have just on the personal basis, but on the larger question of the meaning of Garabandal, what is it in that? So the first thing is that it's coming out again. Somehow I got in touch with Jeffrey Moynihan, who had read my book on Archbishop Vigano, and then somehow I organized this pilgrimage last September with our office here, and okay, yes. Aithna is writing to us in real time from Ireland. Conchita did an interview with Gay Byrne for the
Yep,
Late Late Show way back. So that's
yep, I
again, but
remember
that's
that.
a yeah, that's again is very true, and it's emphasizing the fact that there's almost 40, 45 years that nothing was said. Some films came out, but now the actual visionaries are speaking again, writing a book, doing a book interview. And the real question is, what is she saying? Why did she want this to be translated? What are one or two or three points that strike you, Damien?
Well, as we were just saying, having lived her life, having had time to reflect on all this, she began to articulate, I think in a very wise way, a mature Catholic faith. She's a deeply spiritual person, and she fondly remembers her childhood, and she remembers with great love those apparitions. Um,
Hmm,
and it's
beautiful.
very much a part of her life. She has set out to live her life, what she was taught by the Virgin Mary. And that comes out profoundly in her answers. She's still a very
Oh,
humble lady, who hails from the mountains of northern Spain, and she still speaks that way when she's speaking Spanish. Um, but she's lived in California a long time, so it has changed her outlook on the world, and she's seen things happen and pass, and people who've been very loosely connected with the Garabandal story. And that comes out in some of the journalistic questions and answers that you see in this book. If you look at the blurb of the book, it's quick to mention connections with, the astronaut Neil Armstrong, Elvis Presley and his daughter. All those little details, these little sound bites, they're
well,
not
wait.
the reason why it's worth reading this, but it's curious all the same that they're mentioned at all.
Well, first I'll say I'm struck by your emphasis on her return to the personal, almost to her own soul, the effect of the apparitions on herself, on her soul, on her life, on her spirituality, and with joy, as if she had had a supreme teacher in a way.
Exactly my point. And I've discussed this with many people. Those girls, if you think about it, had the best Catholic catechesis possible.
Hmm.
Anybody who's ever been involved in Catholic catechesis would dream of having the teacher that they had,
Yeah.
12, 13 years old. They know things that are so profound, so spiritual. And the more you look at what they've said when they were younger, the more you realize what catechesis we haven't had, particularly my generation. There's been a huge absence of what I call effective catechesis, and I, I, I can chart that. I can certainly chart that. That's been said by some of your other guests in your podcasts, and it's something that is definitely evident, more so with the backdrop of what these girls have taught us through their experience when they were young.
Okay, so what you're telling us is that the apocalyptic element, which so many people are focused on, whether there'll be a warning, whether there'll be a sign, whether there'll be an illumination of conscience everywhere in the world. These are the thoughts or the predictions associated with Garabandal. But the very first step as we get into this question is Jacinta personally to us, and even in the book interview she gave, is speaking of a personal relationship which filled her with joy and which influenced her whole life. And
Yes.
therefore, it sets to, in my mind, it sets almost to a second stage the entire question of the apocalyptic, the end time scenarios. We forget that Mary was appearing to these children and giving them instruction, love, support that stayed with them through their lives. That's, I think, the first point of this podcast.
Mhm. Um, Behind all of this, you can talk about the apocalypse, you can talk about the prophecies related to Garabandal, all of the scary stuff that probably puts many people off when they first see it. But the real messages of Garabandal, and they are called the messages, the first message and the second message that bookend the events, they have to be emphasized. And I'm going to insist that your audience hear them. October the 18th, 1961,
There you
shortly
go.
after the apparitions began, the message that was given by the Virgin Mary through the Archangel Michael. We must make many sacrifices, perform much penance, and visit the Blessed Sacrament frequently. But first, we must lead good lives. If we do not, a chastisement will befall us. The cup is already filling up, and if we do not change, a very great chastisement will come upon us.
Hmm. Well,
Fast
that's,
forward to the end.
well, of course, I just think where we are in 2024, if we don't lead good lives, if we lead bad lives, chastisements will fall. It's like making bad choices.
Mhm.
And inevitably, if we don't choose to be a little more humble, if we act like we're little gods and goddesses, we may have some
And
bad results.
if we if we don't visit the Blessed Sacrament frequently, should be highlighted in that first message. If we don't live good lives, if we don't perform much penance, repeating things that have been said in authentic and confirmed apparitions like Fatima,
So it's a
then
call for spiritual purification and return to the sort of fundamentals of the faith.
to be consistent with our faith. That's what I
Hmm.
read in that message. And of course, the consequences are apocalyptic. The second message, and this was given to only Conchita, one of the things that people who look at Garabandal assume is that the four visionaries saw apparitions for 4 years, for the expanse of the time there, between 61 and 65. It's not true. Um, all four girls only saw apparitions together in that first summer.
Oh,
One
really?
by one by one, they dropped out of the visions. In fact, a year later, it was just Conchita. From 62 onwards to the end, to 65, it was really the revelation that took place in Garabandal was only through Conchita. And by
All
the
right.
time we
So,
get to 1965, the end, this final message, if I may read it,
yes.
as my message of October 18th, 1961 has not been complied with and has not been made known to the world, I'm advising you that this is the last one. Before the cup was filling up, now it is flowing over. Many cardinals, many bishops, and many priests are on the road to perdition and are taking many souls with them. Less and less importance is being given to the Eucharist. You should turn the wrath of God away from yourselves by your efforts. If you ask his forgiveness with sincere hearts, he will pardon you. I, your mother, through the intercession of Saint Michael the Archangel, ask you to amend your lives. You are now receiving the last warnings. I love you very much, and I do not want your condemnation. Pray to us with sincerity, and we will grant your requests. You should make more sacrifices. Think about the passion of Jesus. And that momentous year, closed like that. And you know what I mean by 1965 being a momentous year.
Are you saying the Second Vatican Council came to an end, or
Yes,
what? Is that your?
yeah, I'm saying that.
Yeah.
Lots of people have seen the parallel of these events in that mountain village taking place while
Hmm.
hugely important events were taking place of global significance in the Vatican.
I'll say so. You're saying, in a sense, the Church decides an ecumenical council. John the 23rd and his advisors. They bring 2,500 bishops together with periti, with monsignors who help them. All sorts of 6,000 journalists are there. They
And
cover.
Malachi Martin.
Malachi Martin is there. Malachi Martin is there, and they overturn the prepared schema of the Vatican, and they
That's
rewrite.
key. That's
They,
really important. Yep.
and that actually was something that then Father Joseph Ratzinger agreed. He was in the first days of the council standing in front of St. Peter's Square handing out mimeographed sheets asking the council fathers to call for the rejection of the schema and for the council to write its own documents in order to make it a legitimate council with
Hmm.
participation of everyone who had come from so far away. And that's part of the reason that very decision, which was then taken a few days later, meant that it wouldn't end. It was intended to end that December. The chairs and other paraphernalia for the council were rented for one fall, one autumn. And then later in that winter and spring, John died. And then Paul VI said, okay, he was elected in 63. And he said, we'll continue the council and we won't just keep the rented chairs, we'll buy the chairs so we can use them. I guess he knew already that it would be more than one more session. So there were 4 sessions, 62, 63, 64, 65. And in those same years, and just before that, in a kind of mirror, there were 4 children in Garabandal hearing that the real thing that is needed is to love God, be humble, make sacrifices, live good lives,
Visit the Blessed Sacrament frequently.
visit the Blessed Sacrament frequently.
It was the Eucharist is at the heart of these messages. And again, so many people are looking at what happened in the 1960s. By the end of the 1960s, we had a huge transformation in the theology behind the Eucharist, and the liturgical practice was totally transformed. And I have to announce my skepticism publicly about whether things went the right way. I think I'm very much on the same side of the fence as dear Father Murr concerning that
Okay.
issue.
Yeah, well, you're not without company, and I would really emphasize when people discuss this, we must remember that Joseph Ratzinger himself went through a long period of evaluation and reflection as he watched the results of Vatican II and had his own journey. We might call it a pilgrimage. And by the time he was Pope, he was saying there were 2 Vatican councils, the council as it was and the Council of the Journalists, which depicted it as a complete revolution, sort of modernizing the church and condemning the traditional church. And I think he said that that was a manufactured council in a sense. So even you might be cautious about having doubts about an ecumenical council, but even the very Pope of the Catholic Church, in a nuanced way, expressed very clearly that he too had come to those conclusions, that it was a very, very difficult to interpret correctly Second Vatican Council. Gonzalo Suarez can't help can't help noticing that these messages in Garabandal happened right after the failed deadline of 1960. You know what she's going to say?
I totally agree with that comment, Gonzalo.
Established by Our Lady for the revelation of Fatima's third secret. Well, this is not Garabandal, but in some way you can at least comment on that, Damien, if you would like.
You can call it coincidence, but, and I'm going to say this, all of this that we're talking about, it hasn't been approved by the church, but if it is true, it would so consistently make sense. Everything we look at fits into what we were warned at that time in Garabandal. And if Garabandal is true, we're still yet to see the fruition and the consequences of all of this.
All right. I wonder, we have several directions we could take. Let's go to the personal. How did you hear about Garabandal and how did you come there? Then later, we're going to try to go into the 61, 62, 3, 4, 5, and then the three great sort of miracles that are expected. So first, your personal story.
My personal story is like a lot of people. I grew up post-Vatican II in a post-Vatican II church. Even though my parents tell me that I was baptized in the old rite just before the liturgical changes kicked in. And I always felt, as a child and as a teenager for sure, that there was something missing in the way the faith was being presented to me if you read the Bible and try to equate the two. And there was this quite clear, how to put it? It was a de-emphasis of the supernatural, which, according to the experts, you will be able to chart back much further than my own lifetime and way before Vatican II, where more and more doubt entered into Catholic theology until it took over the mainstream. And by the time I went to university in the 1980s and to study theology and philosophy, it was quite clearly evident. You could ask fellow students, even some of the teachers, and see that there was a complete neglect of belief in the supernatural.
Well, what you're referring to is probably the question of Western culture in the post so-called Enlightenment period, and with science sort of replacing theology, and say theology was the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages for 1,000 years. People thought if you were intelligent and learned Latin and Greek, you eventually would get to the point of studying God and what it meant that there is a God and what were his characteristics. And this was the highest field of thought. In modern world, the highest field of thought is the atom, the genetic code, it's the weather, and astronomy, and nothing spiritual. In other words, the whole second story of existence, which is sort of above the material, above the natural, we call it the supernatural, above the physical, we call it the metaphysical, above the physical, has been eliminated. And you, in a vague way, as a young man, felt something is missing. And it's because the spiritual has been excised as a myth, or as the opium of the people, as the communists would say, because they were arguing it's a mental disease to go beyond the material, beyond what your eyes and ears and smell can sense, your feeling. Anything else of pure mind and of pure spirit is unreal. But the Christian believes that it's the most real. And this is the fundamental division in our society. But those who retain this belief in the most real, which is expressed also with regard to the most real presence of the Lord in the Eucharist, are increasingly few and challenged and in the corner and mocked and derided.
Let me just interject there, Bob. My thoughts are I do not want to speak badly of my teachers when I was a child, or because I went through Catholic education all the way through to the point of having many highly talented and well-known Catholic professors at university, Jesuits. I have to say, I just went looking elsewhere while I was an adolescent, and I would try to find information that would substantiate my worldview and my faith and the things that needed foundation. And that is how, by chance, in 1980, I saw the BBC documentary interviewing Conchita in New York with her young family, which
Hmm.
is widely available on the internet now. You can see that, and many of the viewers will have seen it already.
So just repeat,
That particular documentary,
BBC 1980, and her
yes.
name is
Well,
Conchita.
Conchita Gonzalez, she was the principal uh, visionary through the
Okay,
Garabandal events.
maybe we can find a link to that interview and post it, but I can't do it right now. Um, so 1980, you're introduced to that. And my thought was, you reflect the longing of the human heart for the divine, which Augustine speaks about. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And it's that we were made for this, and that there's a false paradigm imposed on us by the so called science, but it's actually ignorance, and by the so called enlightenment, but it's actually an endarkenment. And therefore, humanity finds itself in a kind of mental cage, not permitted to rise to the heights of our nature, which is designed to go toward the eternal, the infinite, and the holy. This is not permitted any longer. And now we're heading towards the artificial computer as the kind of replacement for that artificial intelligence. Anyway,
I can see that the hand of God in my life, in particular, speaking through that documentary that many millions of people must have seen, certainly in the English speaking world, and I'm sure in other countries where they did translations of that television documentary.
so what
And
did she say?
Garabandal was made more widely known.
What did she say that struck you?
Well, the message that the two messages that bookend the events uh, and the prophesied events, where there is a God who will act in world history definitively because he loves us, he wants to save us, and if anything that we believe in is true in the creed and in the catechism, that would have to be a part of it as well. There has to be a reality behind it. And nobody really communicated that as well as she did on that television program that I saw back then when I was 12, 13, not much older than they were when they had these experiences.
So what did
And that
that
spoke to
prompt
me.
you? What did that prompt you to do?
Think. More than anything, think. And it just stayed with me for the rest of my adolescence. And when I had the first opportunity, that must have been a year before I went to university, I signed up for a pilgrimage of English and Irish pilgrims to go to Garabandal. And I went there for the first time in 1985
Okay, so
to see for myself
you
and
must
read about.
yes, you must describe as best you can that 1985 pilgrimage.
Okay, you're right. In the village, which was unpaved still, it was very much like um, a farmyard. There were animals progressing through the streets with their farmers, their owners, and the houses were very rustic. And the house that we stayed in had been run by English Garabandal pilgrims since the events. Some of them had been witnesses to those final apparitions in the 60s. And that house, very humble house, was our home for the week. And I took Garabandal books with me that you could buy from usually the promoters in New York at the time. And I was reading those books while I was in Garabandal to find out more and more.
Oh,
Um,
just in the process of your reflection, Michael Stephen is writing, "Hello from the Pilgrim Center in San Sebastian de Garabandal." He's in Garabandal.
Hello, Michael.
We look
Good
forward
to
to
see you.
seeing you inside the Vatican pilgrimage again this year. May God bless you and Our Lady protect you always. Well, Michael is a wonderful scholar as well. Similar to you, I would say, Damien. The two of
Oh
you
no,
are
he's the lucky
remarkable.
one being there.
Okay, why is that? What is the feeling about Garabandal?
Once you get to a certain level immersed in the details, once you've read enough of the witness accounts, and I remember a very good book that was published by a Spanish author who put together a series of witness accounts, eyewitness accounts. The Village Speaks, Garabandal, The Village Speaks. You can't forget it. Once you immerse yourself to that level in what those people saw and what they said and thought, no matter how hard you try, the Garabandal story just does not depart your mind.
Okay,
It's
let's
as
okay,
simple as
let's
that.
let's go. We're gonna not let this go until we really understand. But when I visited, was struck. This was September 5 months ago. This little village in a circle of mountains. It was almost like Shangri-La, in a sense, in your imagination. This place in the Himalayas that, in a novel by James Hilton, this is depicted as a place where people don't grow old. It's a special valley. But in Garabandal, it's a place where people kept what is old. They kept the tradition, and each night, around a few minutes before 7, a bell would start to ring. And we're talking about a town of, I think, only 3 or 4 or 500 people, not too big. And people would start to walk down the streets from their homes. And they'd come to the church, and they'd sit, and then the priest would join them, and Jacinta would join them, and they prayed the rosary. And then I asked, it takes 20, 22, 26, 28 minutes to pray the rosary and the five mysteries. And I asked someone, how long has this been going on? And they said, 500 years. Never has a night been missed. The people of Garabandal have all come together in the village church to remember Christ, because the mysteries are about the coming of Christ into the world, the passion of Christ and death in the world, and the resurrection, coming and leaving of Christ and going to eternity from the world. And the rosary for 500 years was recited in that church, and I felt a kind of energy of prayer and of sacrifice and of life lived and hopes that I felt almost nowhere else.
I witnessed that again. I'd never seen that before anywhere, not in England, not anywhere, where a village still lives their faith in such an evident way. They also have that tradition in the village where they pass a statue of the Virgin Mary in a casket from house to house. They treasure the Virgin Mary in a visible and spiritual way, like certainly I'd never seen before until I spent time there back in the early 1990s when my second attempt to find out more took place.
All right.
Um,
I guess describe that second attempt.
well, I my first visit when I was still very young, and I read those first books in the 1980s. Um, I would say my spiritual journey was probably interrupted by my university days in London, and I think as soon as had gone through that experience, I needed to go back to Garabandal, and at the very end of 1990, I felt the need to pack my bags, throw everything in a car, get on the ferry from England, and I ended up in Santander,
So you took
looking
a
on my
car.
map how to get up to the
I,
village. I did,
I thought you
yeah.
would have flown to Madrid or Bilbao or Santander and then taken some type of taxi or something to Garabandal, but you drove all the way from England.
No, I was determined to stay a bit longer this time, and
Mhm.
I ended up in Santander as a teacher of English, and I stayed for more than 3 years, visiting the village quite regularly, getting to know people who'd lived there for some time, people who were from other countries, people who had become so immersed in what the events promised, many of whom have gone now. And you're talking some of the original promoters of Garabandal, some of the people who did their best to let the world know pre-internet
Yeah,
what
tell us about
Garabandal was.
one or two or three of those people, just because we're trying to come
I have
at
to.
Garabandal from sort of the outside as if we don't know anything, and I actually don't know anything. So go ahead and who were those people that were promoting Garabandal?
There's a lot of wonderful souls who are long since gone who did so much to bring people to the village. And the first lady I remember who lived in Asturias, her name was Adela Bertrand. It could be that some of the viewers of your podcast might remember her. Um, and of course, she spoke English very well, and she had a house in the village, and her family um, longed for the day that the Garabandal events would would come to fruition. And her husband, who was blind, longed to receive his sight back, and they're no longer with us. I'm also thinking of a friend of mine who filled his home with books about everything possible. Um, and he wrote many letters to people all over the world and intrigued me with what he knew. And I probably learned more from his books than I had done in my years at university. And I'm also thinking of some of the
A kind of
families who,
a
who
kind of sage of Garabandal, one of the sort of
most definitely,
you knew him personally.
yes. And there were other people as well who were like that, who I didn't get to know, who bought properties in the village and just said, right, we're staying it. We're not going to leave. They just wanted to stay until the events had happened.
So it's as if in a cold world you try to draw closer to the hearth, where there's some warmth of the spiritual or the
It,
supernatural, and you
yes,
receive that by being in Garabandal. Is that correct?
lots of people over the years have been drawn to Garabandal
So
and
it's not a
enjoyed his
casino.
escape.
It's not a casino or a beachfront resort with
It's
dike.
more it's more a Monte Casino.
So it's in the mountains, and how beautiful is it there?
Stunning. The north of Spain is alpine. Um, it's tropical. It's microclimate. There's probably a bit of snow on the mountains there right now because it's turned very cold in Spain again. Uh, it's green, very verdant compared to most of the peninsula, and
All right.
it has its own way of life. Its agriculture has defined throughout the centuries where a village is, um, and I saw lots of that in those years. Less so now as agriculture has declined.
And so explain this village has above it a path going to a little sort of, and the trees stop, and you're almost on a mountainside with no trees. So you have an enormous vista for
Mhm.
miles
The
out.
village is at the same altitude where the tree line stops. There are forests,
I see.
deciduous forests around, but they're mainly below the level of the village. Everything above the village is scrub pasture, and I think it was Conchita, the principal visionary, her grandfather, I believe it was, who planted the pine trees, the original 9 pine trees, on this bluff above the village. It's a steep, rocky path above the village of it's about 150 meters climb. You have this focal point in a natural arena where the sloping hills and mountains around, wherever you're standing, point to this group of pine trees.
And someone actually said to me that children making their first communion in the 1920s had carried pine cones or pine seeds after the first communion ceremony and gone up to that area and dropped the seeds or planted the seeds, and that the trees came, in a sense, as a product of first communions.
Yes, it was a group of children who just made their first communion that planted these trees.
Okay,
Um,
so it's connected. It's a Eucharistic pine, you might call it, or it's a Eucharistic
Again,
grove, in a
another
sense,
coincidence,
something
if
to
it is a
do.
coincidence.
Eucharist is thanksgiving, and Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith. It's the presence continuing after his crucifixion and death and resurrection of Christ in our world. I will be with you until the end of the age. When you do this, and so we believe Christ is present. We also believe that he's hidden in a sense. We can't see them as we can see each other, as we see our brothers and sisters, but we know that he is present. This is adoring in Eucharistic adoration. And somehow the pines have a Eucharistic origin. But what is supposed to happen at the pines?
Well,
And did the Virgin appear in that grove?
yes,
The
yes, the
children went.
apparitions happened around the village, but very often the vision would carry them up that path to the pines itself. Conchita had some quite important apparitions at the pines, but the original apparitions happened just as you start to climb the path. It's called the calleja in Spanish, little lane,
Mhm.
and it's a hollow. In England, we call them hollows when a road throughout the centuries gets worn down into a depth with tracts, with walls and fields above and trees.
And weren't there some apple trees on the side? I think I recall walking up that path.
To the left, as you're walking up, the final property of the village, the last bit of occupied land, had a house where the teacher lived, the school teacher lived. And there was a garden with an apple tree in it, and that
Hmm.
is the scene for the original apparition of the Archangel Saint Michael. Yeah,
And were the children trying to take the apples?
they were. They've admitted it, and I'm sure they confessed it promptly.
So there's something about conscience. So there's the pines, there's the bottom of the path where there's an apple tree, which is next to the village. Then you go about 5-10 minute walk and you come to this grove looking out over 30 miles of amazing mountains where there's 9 large pine trees. And the Virgin also appeared there. And the confession that you referred to of perhaps snitching a couple of apples, maybe, I imagine, maybe even already have fallen down. So they were just using apples that were on the ground,
I've
perhaps.
thought I've
But the,
thought about it because if you look at the dates when that first apparition happened, it's not the time of the year you want to pick apples, especially so in the north of Spain. You've got to leave them for a good few months after that. So they were probably tiny little, very, very ripe, hard apples. Uh, it was June. It was the middle of June, so they wouldn't have been good to eat at all. It was completely pointless taking them off the tree at that when they're that small.
so middle
Think
of
about
June
that.
1961,
Yeah.
yes. And so the first St. Michael appears, and then the lady appears. Can you just go through that again?
Well, they received the apparitions of the archangel for a couple of weeks before the Virgin Mary appeared. So I think the first apparition happened 18th of June, 1961. That was the Archangel Michael, and the Virgin Mary didn't appear until the 2nd of July.
Okay, and how could 4 different children have the same vision? If
Don't
it
know.
isn't, if it isn't
I really
objectively.
don't know, Bob. It's a mystery. It's all a mystery, and they really didn't know who they were looking at in these original, the very first apparitions. It was a deduction that they made later. They describe who they saw and what they saw, and to them it was a young looking boy as the angel, and they described the Virgin Mary, as they later understood it to be, as a beautiful young woman. And they described the clothes and the
Yeah,
appearance, and it was very much like that. You're talking about educationally developed young people for that age. They've often been described as people as children who had probably lagged behind their peers, nationally speaking, at the time. They would not have been equivalent to maybe children their age who grew up in the cities. It was a very, very rural education, and they lived a very rural life. And what they were describing,
excuse me.
what they were articulating, must have been for them and for the people making those original notes. They were dealing with very, very simple facts,
Okay,
simple descriptions.
but as soon as these started, and someone had suggested in the comment that it was past 1960 when people had expected the Vatican to release the third secret of Fatima. So now a new message is coming. The first part of it, as you described, was sacrifice and go to be pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament. In other words,
Perform much penance as well, yeah.
so keep somehow your spirit, your soul under your control. Don't lose it. Don't forget it. It's sort of the opposite of what's happened in the rest of the modern world. In a sense, it's the opposite message from the entire trajectory of the narcissistic, self-oriented, self-fulfilling society that has become almost totalitarian now.
It's hard for me to use such words, but yes, you described it as accurately as I could.
And so the message is, but they also speak of having a relationship with this lady as if they were speaking to a mother or an aunt or even a friend. And could you describe any of that? How did that happen?
Well, earlier I referred to their experience with the apparitions. They talked as if they were speaking with somebody who was a member of their family, someone who became their friend. They had such a close relationship develop as a result of the apparitions. It had a lasting effect, and certainly in that book that we were talking about earlier, you can still see that effect on how Jacinta has lived her life and how she still has kept to her faith, and how it hinges on her supernatural faith.
All right, so I think we've tried to establish in our own humble way that a apparition occurred. The children saw a beautiful lady. They heard words. They started to tell the people of the village. And pretty soon after, many people were coming. Isn't that true?
Yes.
You know,
they were astonished. They were astonished by what they saw.
Yeah, all over Spain, people were saying something is happening, apparitions.
Yeah, it made the movie reels of the day.
The movie reels of the day. So,
yeah.
And we have those even on the internet. People, if they wish, can find the girls or the children of Garabandal, and they can find movies of what is happening to them in the 1960s. Their faces are all directed together towards one spot in the air, and you have to say either they're possessed in some strange way or psychologically linked, or something. They're looking at something. You can't explain it any other way.
The civil authorities and the church authorities sent up experts, and they all did their tests and made their own analyses of what they were witnessing, and it all got very heavily documented.
And some of the tests, I think, were remarkable, like the weight of the children, that type of thing.
They did try to lift them when they were in their ecstasies, to lift them off the ground, and they just couldn't. They were immovable.
So strong men, one or two, okay. Ecstasy means to be out of oneself, as it were, to be out of oneself towards some experience or reality that transcends oneself. Ecstasy.
It completely cut them off from the reality of.
So they had halfway left the sphere of the material in some sense. And the people come to try to lift them, and they can't. They're too heavy because they are in a kind of eternal gravity. You know, almost thinking of Simone Weil, gravity and grace. There's a reality to heaven. We tend to think, oh, that's a myth or a fable, but in fact, it's more real than this that we live in.
Correct. Yeah. I think the witnesses saw what they saw, took away such astounding events, and people were put in a situation of having to believe those first witnesses without having seen what they had seen. And because so much of it all and so much of what the girls were saying and what was being documented was so astonishing and so far removed from what people were living in the 1960s, which was heading headlong towards a modern material world.
Mm-hmm.
It just departed people's consciousness to take serious And I think many people have suggested that Garabandal was suppressed during subsequent decades. It may be that the church wanted to sweep it under the carpet, but I think probably it just was so far-fetched in most people's minds that it just didn't bear a second thought. I can fully understand why some people just look at Garabandal once and think, well, yeah, it's just too much to take in. It can't be true.
Now let's go before we run out of time, and we are spending a lot of time. Perhaps some people have become bored with us, but
I'm sorry.
no, I don't know. I just don't know. But I'm interested. So the three things that finally came to Conchita as a message that are most connected with Garabandal. If we start with the idea of sacrifice and the Eucharist adoration at the beginning, and sort of protection
I've summarized it. I've summarized it as best I can.
with those two,
Taking
yes,
those messages, you've
right,
got the two messages that bookend the apparitions,
yeah,
and you can analyze what those two messages are, assuming they're from heaven. This is really important. There are 10 moral imperatives.
okay,
The first 4 appear in the first message. Make many sacrifices, perform much penance, visit the Blessed Sacrament frequently, lead good lives. Fast
okay,
forward to
mhm,
1965, turn the wrath of God away from yourselves by your efforts, ask his forgiveness with sincere hearts, amend your lives, pray to us with sincerity, make more sacrifices, and this is the last one, which is the killer punch for me. Think of the passion of Jesus.
all right.
10
So,
moral imperatives in what heaven
okay,
is
so
allegedly telling
almost
us.
like 10 Commandments, the 10 imperatives of Garabandal. And
If you
then,
reduce those messages, that's what you see.
yeah, okay, so nothing there that seems needing to be uh, condemned or criticized or rejected. But what about the warning, the illumination of consciences, and the sign that will remain? Explain those three things.
Later on in the apparitions, it became apparent that the Virgin Mary had told the girls that there would be a future worldwide warning. The Spanish word is aviso. And it's curious to me, as to many people who've known about Garabandal for decades, it's been equated with the term illumination of conscience, which to me is an understatement to call the prophesied aviso, warning, simply an illumination of conscience.
Mhm.
If you look at what in the 70s Conchita and Mariloli has said about what the warning, the prophesied worldwide warning is, it's much more than just individuals having their conscience illuminated. It is a direct action by God that is going to be globally experienced simultaneously in the space of 5 minutes that will not just make people's lives flash past them in front of them, but it will be heaven's attempt to get people to amend their lives, which is mentioned as one of those moral imperatives.
Hmm.
So it's not just illuminating our consciences, it's warning us. It's called a warning for a reason. And a warning is saying, do this, because there are apocalyptic consequences if we don't. And that prophesied warning is quite scary, and it scared a lot of people off. A lot of people, level-headed people, have looked at Garabandal and seen that prophecy associated with it, which clearly still hasn't been realized, but will one day when God is ready. And it's very much principal place in what we learn from those revelations during those years. The
People
visionaries are sincere about it. They say this will happen
they say that
globally.
people say that time will seem to have stopped. Almost like, what was it, Joshua fighting? He asked for the sun to stop to allow more time, so the sun was stopped. It's as if we need a moment to stop this headlong rush towards the artificial computer, which will lock us into an algorithm, and all humanity will be kind of woof, and we will have this super intelligence far superior to any one of us that will instruct us on what to think and what to do. Before we do that, there's a warning to remain human, to remember
To
our
amend
soul.
our lives, to amend that. No, it's for us to correct our lives from the deviations that we've all taken. It's to get us kneeling down in confession again and meaning
So
it and sticking to our amended lives. The warning is about that. It's not just
okay,
about having our
so
conscience illuminated.
and so when how will that be communicated? How do people think it will be communicated? Is it
Who
going to be a
knows?
television announcement, a podcast? Is it going to be a voice from heaven?
It's going to
So
be on
from
God's command. It's going to be on
from
God's command, and it's not something that we can plan for.
but people will hear it and know it that they're
We
being.
will physically and especially spiritually experience it. It's a physical. Conchita has gone on record saying that it is a physical experience as well as a profoundly spiritual one, and we'll know that it's from God.
Right. So it's like
Even atheists. That's it's biblical. The prophecy of the Garabandal warning cannot be seen through any other lens. It is biblical in proportions. Only it goes beyond the ancient Near East.
right, okay. Where
It's
does this
the whole planet.
where does the prophecy come from? What were the words exactly?
Uh, when you listen to how Conchita reports it, she tells you how she was told by the Blessed Virgin Mary during an apparition. From what I remember, it was when she was having an apparition on her own. I can't give you the precise date, though I'm sure some of your viewers will have it at hand in front of them. This this particular instruction that she had was to tell the world that this is going to happen.
I see. But
And she's
this warning will come.
yes,
Okay.
and it's going to be in the same year or within a 12-month year, within a year of the following prophecy, where something quite extraordinary and biblical in proportions will happen at those pine trees above the village.
What could that
Uh,
be? I mean, will it
it's
be like a pillar of salt or a pillar of marble or a pillar of fire will suddenly spring up, or a spring of water? But how could it be? How could
there's
something?
only a, there's only a few people who can answer that, and they're no longer with us. Padre Pio is believed to have seen this event, the great miracle, before he died, and also a Jesuit priest who was there at the very first summer of these apparitions,
I
who was
remember.
drawn into the apparition,
Didn't he pass
Padre
away?
Luis Maria Andreu, a Jesuit
Yeah.
who witnessed this future miracle at the Pines during an apparition that the girls were having, that he was observing. He'd been sent with his brother or brothers to observe what was happening. And the Jesuit connection with Garabandal is very, very interesting. It's a book within itself. Uh, there were squads of Jesuits sent up during those apparitions to see what was happening and to report back. One of their seats of learning was 20 miles from this village. The building is still there. The Pontifical University of Comillas was one of the most important Jesuit training schools.
Yes, we saw it.
The north of Spain is as you know, the heartland of the Jesuits. This has a very, very interesting connection to the Jesuits. There's no doubt about it. And to find ourselves right now with a Jesuit Pope
Well,
does make you wonder.
is there any connection between the prophecies or messages of the Garabandal and anything we've seen with Pope John Paul, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis?
There is a very interesting comment that comes out of those first testimonies of the girls when they had seen and heard about, I think it was when Pope John the 23rd had died. they seem to know the timeline of events and how many popes would be left before the end times would start.
And what did they see?
They said the report is that there would be 3 more popes, if I'm correct. Somebody correct me, please, if I'm wrong on that one.
But
But
we've already had 5. Paul the Sixth. Well, maybe so. Paul might have been just immediately elected after John's death, so maybe Paul was included in the past, in a sense, already a pope. So 3 more.
I don't know how to.
John Paul
I don't know how to
I,
do the head count.
John Paul II, and Benedict would be 3. Anyway,
I'm not going to speculate on it, but there are different explanations of which pope counts in that prophecy, that particular detail. I'm not sure whether it matters all that much, but
no. But in any case, the low number suggests that time and this epic of human history only has
yes,
30, 40, 50 years, and that's a kind of near terminus.
yes. I mean, if Garabandal is true, if that particular detail is true about there being a limited number of popes left, then we haven't got long.
Okay. And of course, these were supposed to occur before the girls passed away. They're now in their 70s.
Well, Conchita has a particular role with that great miracle at the Pines. She has been instructed by the Virgin Mary in her apparitions to announce that miracle 8 days in advance to allow the faithful to arrive to witness it, particularly the sick who will be cured as a result of simply being there.
I see. So it sounds like some type of appearance of the Holy Spirit. And that wind of the Spirit will be so holy that it will heal all disease and deformity if it's in that location. That's what I'm struck by.
I'm struck by the biblical connotations with everything. By far, the greatest number of miracles that Jesus performed in the Gospels, you can count them if you want. They're all healing miracles, virtually all of them.
Okay. So there'll be a healing associated with this almost forgotten, little known apparition of Garabandal, which will include a warning to everyone in the world, a healing to those who are present, and then an eternal or sort of everlasting sign. What's that called?
There's going to be a permanent sign as a result of that miracle that will take place at the Pines, and it will be, you'll be able to televise it. This is a detail again that Conchita is on record as having said. You won't be able to touch it though. It won't be something that you can touch, but you can see it, and people will know forever that it is there.
All right.
And again, that has huge implications.
It's almost like a sign of some sort of a covenant.
God's signature on the planet. That's what I would call it.
Okay, so there was one more thing, and then we could come back to go through everything that Jacinta wrote in her book, and whether we're going to get the book published into English, these other questions, and then more about our pilgrim.
Our ambition to do that I think that would be monumental if people could reflect on what she says in Spanish in that book.
Okay.
And I think it would make a big difference for a lot of people.
But the people say that the lack of validity or validation came from that declaration of Conchita in that second bookend in 65, where she heard the Virgin speak to her and say, many priests, many bishops have gone astray, many cardinals, they're leading souls to perdition. And because she had included those words, it was felt improper for church authorities to approve this as a legitimate holy apparition. They felt it couldn't have been said if this was coming from Our Lady.
And can I add another detail there?
Is that a correct judgment?
It is, but for decades, they never included the name cardinals in that. In fact, right from the offset, the church authorities refused name cardinals in that claim, that it was too hard hitting
But that
for
was
anyone
in
to
it.
even utter.
What was the actual quotation?
Many bishops and many priests are on the road to perdition. I remember the first time I read it back in the 80s.
So
It was only ever printed that way.
But so what was it? What was Conchita's? What did she actually hear?
Cardinals as well.
All right. So here we have a cover up inside the apparition.
It was seen as a prudent thing to do at the time. Clearly, you're talking about a very different Spain in those days, where the church had much more influence than I think in any country it has today, and it would have been overstepping the mark to write cardinals, even though the girl Conchita knew that that's what she was told to say and write down. It was never publicly stated that way, probably until the 1990s.
And where do you think so how about our condition today, Damien? How about our faith? What's the state of the faith?
Many cardinals, many bishops, and many priests are on the road to perdition and are taking many souls with them.
Well, we have to conclude on a kind of up note.
Please do.
I think you can find something here, Damien. Your whole life, you were drawn to this almost like a moth to a flame. You left England, you saw a program, you saw Conchita on television speaking about an encounter with the Virgin Mary. You got in your car, you took a ferry, you drove to Spain, you stayed for 3 years, then you came back again. Now you've been 12 more years. It's now 2024. It's been something that has drawn you to it your whole life. Are you happy that you have been drawn toward Garabandal?
I'm still thinking about that one. And it could be that, we don't know when we're going to go. And we don't know whether we're going to live to see these events happen. And I've seen enough people who firmly believe that they would happen one day depart. Some of them are buried in the cemetery in Garabandal. And I don't think we have to be there when these events happen. And probably when I was younger, I thought we did have to be there when these events happen. And reading Jacinta's thoughts and having lived much more of life, it's clearly following those 10 moral imperatives from these messages that matter the most. We do have to amend our lives in our own way, with our own efforts, and to be sincere before God, as sincere as we are in the confession box. We need to show God as much sincerity as possible and amend our lives. And in Lent, and as we approach Holy Week, think of the Passion of Jesus.
Yes. So we will return to you very soon, and we'll have you as a regular guest as we watch these events unfold. We will finish this Lent according to your instructions and counsel. We will think of the Passion of Jesus, and we will think of his suffering, and we will try to amend our lives.
I firmly believe these moral imperatives came from heaven in the 1960s for a reason.
All right. To save humanity. To save souls.
Last chance saloon.
Damien, I appreciate very much. I would love to continue, but we have to eventually stop. And I think we've left some things untouched and unanswered, but we'll return to those. We'd be happy to have questions from any viewers, and we will try to have programs in the future to answer those questions. And we certainly could be in correspondence with anyone. You could write to us at Inside the Vatican magazine, And I have an email, moynihanreport@gmail.com. And we'd be very happy if you liked our program. And we'd be happy if you subscribe to our channel. Then you get a little ping before we have another program so you don't miss it. This has been live on the 23rd of February. Is that correct, Damien?
Yep. It's in the old calendar, the feast of St. Peter Damian, Doctor of the Church.
But does this mean it's your name day today, Damien?
It's one of them.
According to the old calendar.
Because he's a doctor of the church, I wouldn't claim he's my saint.
Damien, you are so sensible. You're not exalted. You're not inebriated, but you are, in that very commonsensical approach, you're authoritative. I really appreciate you so much.
And I want to say to you, and I'm sure lots of your viewers want to say this, thank you for having the courage to communicate so much of what you do to the world, and having used your privileged place of being in the Vatican to, with considerable authority, put your endorsement in what it is that we've been talking about. Because there's a lot of people out there that, over the decades, have chosen not to do that.
Well, we will see what God will bring to pass. But I think there's something that will give us great hope and great joy in the midst of all of the terrible trials that we face. So thank you very much, Damien, on this day, and best wishes to everyone. Farewell.
Thank you very much, Bob. Bye-bye.